Hey guys, it's Kent. Welcome back. Kent Lindstrom. You know, I was, I was so close. Kent, not that typical name, Silicon Valley, not that big a place. I thought maybe, hey, I can just go by one name, like Sting, like, Kent, the venture capitalist. Can't do it. There's another one. There's at least two of us in Silicon Valley. He's great, by the way. I'll have him on sometime and you can meet him. Um, But Kent Lindstrom, I am a co-founder and a partner of the venture capital firm 8-Bit Capital. That is a seed stage venture firm here in Silicon Valley, and I'm the host of this podcast. And I think you're gonna like this one. It has a good vibe. Nick Sturiale is my guest, and this sort of has a vibe. He's worked in venture capital for a long time. Has the vibe of somebody looking back at and kind of calmly reflecting on a career. Nick is not old. Nick is not done, but he's worked at Seven Rosen, at Carlyle Group, and Ignition, and has just seen a few cycles. And as I take you on this journey through Silicon Valley and introduce you to some kind of amazing people, I think you're gonna like meeting Nick here. This is one for the real sort of venture capital wonks, so people who really want to understand how the market works and how it's evolved and how it's faced off against different things happening across the cycle. So think you're going to like it. I enjoyed my conversation. Appreciate your being here. Nick Sturiale, my guest today. All right, welcome back. This is the Something Venture Podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest, I should have asked you how to pronounce it. Is it Nick Sturiale? Am I saying that right?
Yep, you're saying correct. Yep.
Excellent. Nick is a partner at Ignition Partners. He's also been a partner. He's also been at Icon Ventures, Seven Rosen Funds, and Carlyle Group. He's been doing venture capital for a while, and we'll get into that. But before that was an entrepreneur, which we'll also get into, and has invested in a number of companies. You'd know Splunk, you'd know Bill.com, you'd know Reputation.com, but has overall invested something like, or his companies have raised about $180 million and returned over $1 billion in capital to investors, which is kind of incredible. So you've had quite a career there.
I've been very lucky. I've been very fortunate.
Yeah. Well, and I tell you, so normally, when I started this podcast, I thought talking to venture capitalists and getting their observations about what entrepreneurs should or should not do was actually not that interesting because most of them had kind of ridiculous ideas and nobody wanted to hear that anyway. But I think you've had such a amazing group of companies you've invested in. You've invested over such a, as they say, the
25
proverb,
years.
interesting period of time and so many things. I thought it'd be interesting to kind of get your sense and your take on the market overall. And those are just kind of some incredible companies. I mean, I just think I talked to somebody who was at Bill.com. Now, were you there? What phases were you there? Were you there
I
for
was
the?
there before it went public. I was there. I think we did the Series C, but I was on the board for, I forget, maybe 5 years.
Okay, because they had the incredible thing when COVID hit, right? They were like
Yes.
they were like a Zoom.com on the on the billing side, right?
Yeah, and they I'm sure Renee they went through a ton of challenges building that company, and I would say Bill is a poster child for just grinding to get it right over many years, and it
Yeah.
was not easy, and there was not a lot of celebrity moments until the thing really reached critical mass and then took
Yeah.
off.
I want to ask you about that. As you know, we invest from the seed stage, so we go on some kind of interesting journeys. What do you think is a what do journeys of companies look like compared to kind of what people think they look like? I feel like there's more companies that you think Build.com, up and to the right, or Chime, or UiPath, and then you talk to somebody who's not trying to promote themselves, and they're like, well, we invested when nobody else would, and we'd kind of written it off. And
Yes.
what are the you've seen a lot of companies. What are the paths the companies take?
Well, I mean, it's almost bespoke. The part of the challenge is that the media and zeitgeist understanding of what's happening it tends to blot out how things got to where they are right now, and it sort of it sort of assumes away the luck and timing aspect of a lot of it. Um, and often what made the company successful had nothing to do with its original business plan.
Yep.
There's serendipity. There is, I'm not saying these aren't smart, thoughtful people, they are, but there, no one understands how much of the percentage is luck and timing
Yeah.
until they're in it.
Yeah.
And my analogy is startups are like surfers on surfboards, all the way, a mile down the water, 100 yards off the beach, and we're all looking back, looking for a wave.
Yeah.
And you don't know if the wave's coming your way or if it's a half a mile down the ocean. And so that's the challenge is are you part of that little group of surfers that get the wave?
Yeah. Yeah. I had Eric Paley on recently, and he was talking about m- kind of themes like the sharing economy or whatever the current thing is. And he pointed out, and I guess they've done analysis on this, but I guess you can kind of just think it through too, that that by the time something becomes an idea, like the sharing economy, the iconic company, and in that case it would be Airbnb, is like 8 years old.
Yes, yes,
Right?
yes,
So
yes.
Airbnb didn't go, oh, sharing economy, we have an idea. It was there already.
Well, and what made Airbnb successful was not what people think of it today. And it's the old line: alpha lies in what the conventional wisdom says that won't work.
Right.
And the other, great cliche is most markets are, why do I need this? That moves into how did I live without it?
Right.
And so most generational iconic companies are market builders, they're market makers, and they convince a constituency to go from why do I need this to how did I live without it?
Yeah.
And those are the big ones.
Yeah.
And so you have to start with the idea that the entrepreneur, the investors are almost drunk with optimism in the face of tremendous skepticism.
Yeah. And how did you come into, and I'll ask you more questions about that in a second, but how did you come into this? You were an entrepreneur, which
Yes.
you can I've heard different numbers, but people kind of conflate operator, which means somebody who had a job, maybe worked at Facebook, with somebody who started a company, took money from investors and returned it or did not. I think it's less than 10% of venture capitalists. How did you come into this industry when you
Well,
did from being an entrepreneur?
so I will just make it a short story. So I was at Cal in 99, 2000 at the business school. This is when business plan competitions were the fashion. I started a company with two other guys in a very geeky technical space around metrology automation. I know that's too sexy for words. And this is
Yeah.
when, pets.com was happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
We entered the business plan competition, and if you could fog a mirror, you could get in. We ended up winning the competition, and there was a handful of VCs that were judges, and then we took a seed check from Seven Rosen, which ended up becoming my employer. So I ran that company for a couple of years, got a real CEO in to take over for me, and we ended up selling the company for 172 million 2.5 years later. So when people say, how do you get into the venture business? I say, well, the best way to do it is to make money for your GPs.
Right. Right. That's incredible. And so you come into so why not start a fourth or fifth company versus becoming, people ask us this all the time, and, being a venture capitalist is a lovely job, but why did you kind of say, hey, I'm gonna invest and let other people do the,
Well,
do the
I
building?
will say this a little tongue in cheek, but my fundamental attitude: what is the job with the least amount of effort that pays the most amount of money? And it always looked to me from afar like VC was that gig.
Yeah.
Like it felt like they sat in their offices with their feet up and, cashed distribution checks.
Yeah.
Of course, after I got into it, I was like, holy shit, that was
Yeah.
way off.
And what were you as you come into it? And by the way, VC should never really complain about their job compared to an entrepreneur. But as you got into it, what did you learn that where you weren't actually putting your feet up on the desk and
Yeah, well, one is the feedback cycle is very slow. You don't know if you're any good at it for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. It is it's a difficult job internally to its own partnership in terms of getting your deal done and getting a track record going.
yeah,
And then having the ability to do the important things as a company goes through its challenges at the board level, meaning do you replace the CEO? Do you change the strategy? How do you influence people indirectly? How do you know when the company's in deep trouble and you just got to park it? There's just a lot of pattern recognition development that is hard to do if you're not in it.
Yeah. And do
And
you oh,
that's
go ahead.
the cycle you have to go through.
And how do you feel you are now? You talk to VCs and like their big hit was the first thing they did, and some of them it was like the last thing they did. Do you feel you were naive and lucky early on, and now you're, you know exactly what you're doing, or how did that kind of evolve over time?
Boy, I wish I had a good answer to that because yeah, the problem is everyone is ego and biases get involved in how they see themselves and their own performance. I will my I will say I do think venture is a generational business because technology goes through platform shifts,
Yep.
and older people have a hard time appreciating a new platform shift. They just do. Not saying you can't be good at it, but most of us become successful doing a certain thing and want to repeat that. And that's not the way the industry works. And
Right.
so a lot of it is hustle, shoe leather, getting involved in a couple of deals that catch the wave, and then having your own self-awareness about getting off that platform and getting onto the next
Yep.
one and knowing when to do that. And it's hard because a bull market and genius get highly tied together, and so our
Yeah.
brains don't want to do that.
Yeah. So as you think about the concept of catching a wave, which is, starting to maybe starting to move before the waves developed, why is it so difficult to find product market fit? Why is product market fit so kind of in retrospect, it's all super obvious, right? And everybody's like, oh, I knew this and I knew that. But at the time, it's not that obvious.
Yeah, and I think you could spend your next 10 podcasts on finding PMF and you still would barely scratch the surface.
All right.
I will say after 25 years and 100 startups, I think the one thing I regret uh, not studying in college was behavioral psychology. I think when you, for example, Jeffrey Moore wrote Crossing the Chasm, which is, an iconic
Right.
idea. Embedded in that, though, that doesn't really come out is the chasm is really about trust. There's a trust chasm.
Right.
And when you think about uh, our biases, whether we're the entrepreneur selling the product or the customer's bias is looking at the product, there's like a bunch of things going on. So on our side, on the vendor side, we have two fundamental biases. One is curse of knowledge. We are intimately familiar with our product, which means we tend to overvalue its capabilities and undervalue its limitations because it's our baby. We think our baby's a prodigy and we don't
Yeah.
see the limitations. And then the other thing is what I would call the empathy gap, meaning we don't walk in the customer's shoes. We don't see what they see. They only care about themselves, not about us. And they might not even use the product the way we intended. And then they blame us for a pile of error.
Right.
So those two things on our side are serious eyesight, line of sight issues about seeing where the demand is.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, there's four fundamental biases on the customer side. One is reactance, risk, fear, meaning, do I have something to lose? If I do, I'm going to move very slowly. If I have nothing to lose, I might move fast. You've got skepticism. Doesn't my other vendor do this already? I
Right.
thought they already did this. Inertia, which is a very powerful thing, which is I'm busy. I
Yeah.
don't have time to do this. And then lastly, I think a big one is hyperbolic discounting. Our brain um, perceives value based on how fast the reward or the punishment happens. Meaning, if we get the reward immediately, we value it massively. If it takes 3 months to get the reward, we discount the value massively. Same thing on the punishment side.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I worked with at one point James Curry and Sen Janowski, who started NFX, the venture firm, And one of the things that Stan always said, form of that was like the people would create these products, like kind of consumer products that were better, like kind of better. Like, hey, this is better than Evite. And he was like, look, your thing has got to be 10 times better than the other thing and 10 times easier. Like if you want to compete with a dating site, you need to find your spouse on it in a minute. Like if you want to
Yeah.
beat the incumbent, basically.
Yes. I totally agree, but the reality is V1 of that product ain't going to be 10 times better.
Right.
It's not realistic. And so
Yeah.
the question becomes, is there something, narrow inside of that that could be more convenient faster? Is there something, you can't, you got to learn how to walk before you jog. And
Yeah.
so that's the question is can you get a half-baked product to hit a convenience value prop fast?
Yeah. And how do you, so an entrepreneur, how do you parse, it's easy from the outside or, you read the book and here's how you do it. But how do you know when an entrepreneur and how does an entrepreneur know when they're being a, I feel like that people have started pivoting and moving off of things quicker than they used to on the one hand. On the other hand, there is a point where you're just persisting on something that nobody needs. You're
Yeah.
persisting on the, podcast app when, Apple's
Yeah.
got the free podcasting app and oh boy, maybe it's time to move on, right?
Yeah, that's, again, it comes back to biases and behavior. We're optimists. We have a hard time with sunk cost, letting go. So we're all replete as human beings. We are just replete with this sort of emotional whipsaw for ourselves, and it shows up in that. I think on the when do you know, it is hard because there's a delay. There's asymptomatic feedback, right? You do something and it might take 3 or 4 months for the feedback to really show up, saying, was that the right change of the product? Uh, but I do think, my dad, when I was growing up, used to say, watch what they do, not what they say,
Yeah.
which always stuck with me.
Yeah.
And if they are using something, even if it's half baked, that tells you a lot. If they keep asking for something and they don't do anything, you don't, you're off.
Yeah.
So watch their movement towards the product, their use of it, their engagement level, if they churn out how fast. There are proxies out there.
Yeah. It's interesting. My partner, Jonathan Abrams, has started several companies where the product became popular. And he always pointed out that he'd have some, hey, here's my new thing, consumer thing. Do you want to try it? And all of his friends were like, oh, I love it. I love it. I use it every day. And he's like, do they know that I can just look at the database? I know who's using it and who's not.
Yes.
And so as he built companies, when people said they were using Never Touch, he's like, "Hey, that's a loser." But when he looked and they were actually coming in every day, twice
Yes.
in the database and not telling, he was like, okay, that might be, that might be a thing.
I think the other big one too, and I wrote a blog about this recently. I would say if there's one profound shortcoming of Silicon Valley is we're bad at listening. And I mean listening to understand. We go into new prospects and we just start selling.
Yep.
And we don't listen, look at body language tells, try to really observe what their reaction is. We just keep talking until we hope we hit something that they like.
Yeah.
And so we miss all of the I don't care signal.
Yeah. And you kind of need a product to do that, though, don't you? Like, because we have people who kind of ideate where they're like, I'm just going to go interview a bunch of people. And
Yes,
that seems like it's a little too, even if you listen carefully, it's a little too abstract.
it is abstract, but I think there are ways of asking empathic questions that start to say, really, what matters to you? Like if you could change 2 things about your job today, what would you do? You stop selling and you start asking. I'm not saying you do have to get a product in front of them because then you'll get the rest of the revealed preferences.
Yeah.
But you have to start with the idea that your perception of their problem and their perception of the problem might be different.
Yeah. So advice to an entrepreneur. So you've been on a lot of boards. So, companies doing well enough to get your capital. And now you've got a board and we've experienced this to detriment, frankly. You've got 5 people on the board who all think they're pretty smart. You've been an entrepreneur, somebody else worked at McKinsey, somebody else worked at everyone thinks they're smart.
Yeah.
Um, and here you are, and you've never run a company before. and you look to, we did this when we were young entrepreneurs. You look to your board and you say, well, you don't ask for advice, but you get it.
Yeah.
Um, right. So, how should an entrepreneur sort of think about an esteemed, successful venture capitalist giving them advice?
Yeah. It's a challenging one because you want to be diplomatic about it, but you also need to parse good advice from Mike Maples. Called it rock fetching, which is you should go do this and you run and get a rock and bring it back. And it was an absolute waste of time.
Right.
And so discerning rock fetching advice from, hey, I'm telling you something that's going to happen to you in 6 months. You might want to just think about this.
Right.
I
Um, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, no, I was going to say, so you're in a board meeting and, people are, somebody just got back from a conference. And so what's our
Yes.
China strategy? And someone else
Yes.
went to a different conference. What's our mobile strategy? That's
What's
that
our
whole
Gen
thing.
AI strategy?
Yeah. Right. Right. Whatever it is today. Exactly.
Yeah, and I think you got to tell me more, and then you also have to say, look, everything has a trade-off, everything has an opportunity cost. If you want me to go do this, what do you want me to stop doing?
Yeah.
And so don't let them just, throw out 30,000 foot ideas that are not practical and force them into the what do you want me to not do?
Yeah.
I got limited resources, I'm under huge time constraint, and
Yeah.
just bring them in to the decision. Don't let them just throw out useless bon mots.
Yeah. It's interesting. And how, I mean, is this a reason maybe that a second time entrepreneur has an advantage? Because that's all great, but when, whoever it is, Doug Leone's saying, "Hey, I think this is a good idea." It's a special guy to go, I don't know.
Well, at the end of the day, you know 100 times more about the business than the board does. The board is 3 chapters behind. Yes,
Yeah.
they have pattern recognition. Yes, they're another company, so they can provide contextual observation. But at the end of the day, you're in the account, you're talking to the customer, you're looking at their face. You have way more knowledge than they do. So
Yeah.
you help them understand what they don't see when they're offering advice that is just maybe it's not the right time or it's just not contextually relevant.
Yeah. Is there a form of advice that a VC should be? And by the way, I've heard very prominent, you would know them, venture capitalists say that 80% of the advice from venture, this is a little provocative, but 80% of the advice from venture capitalists is damaging, rock
Yes,
fetching.
yes.
15% is probably neutral and 5% is helpful. What do you think?
I always want to, what I'd ask Kent is, what percent was your advice? Was that in the 5% or the 80%?
That's always five.
Yeah, of course. Everybody is above
Jeez.
average in their own calculation.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of truth to that statement. The hardest part is they do have pattern recognition. A lot of them do. I always feel like a VC in some respects is like someone who is becoming an MD and is interning in the hospital. The reason why they're up for 48 hours is they're watching a cycle of sickness to health and they're
Right.
seeing that cycle. And that does become a useful thing around startups placing bets because they see
Yeah.
sickness to health cycles. And so there's value there.
Yeah.
And that's what you're paying for. But there are a lot of, let's call them dilettantes that never ran a company, never did a startup, never met a payroll, never had to ship a 1.0 release that
Yeah.
are opining on what you should do. And you have to politely say thank you and then disregard them.
Yeah. That seems to be the big one that we saw where, kind of laying, sometimes you have to do it, but like laying off people was just a really, do this, do that. It was a very sort of flip, not empathy. Which learn English. Not empathy for like, hey, we know it's pretty tough, but you've got to do that, and so if we need to take another cycle to make sure it's the right thing to do, let's take that cycle or whatever it is, as opposed to like, oh, I'm playing, Succession and cut this guy and that guy sucks. And,
Yes,
it's easy in the boardroom, right?
yes, you don't have to do the dirty deed. Uh, on the other hand, entrepreneurs, we're all victims of our optimism. Sometimes hold on to an OpEx for too long when they know they should have whacked it 6 months ago.
Yeah,
Is their
that's right.
hope, hope is a strategy that permeates a lot of business plans.
That's right.
And so sometimes there's the hard thing about hard things.
Yeah,
But I think you force a board member who's giving you advice to clarify their advice.
right. I think that makes sense too. I think also one thing that's helped me, well, now that I am a venture capitalist, I understand that it is kind of try to understand where you fit into that person's life because
Yes,
you're not their only company.
yes.
And so you kind of have to think to yourself, okay, am I this person's most important company? Meaning maybe they're really thinking about this advice or not. Or am I not this person's most important company? And they came up with that idea about 4 minutes into the board meeting. And, if I push back, they'll be like, oh, yeah, you're right.
My old partner, Steve Dow, when I was at Seven Rosen, said this, and always stuck in my head is you have to measure the time delay between when you suggest an idea to a CEO and the CEO thinks it's their idea.
Mm,
Because CEOs don't really make moves until they think it's their idea. And
right.
so a lot of what a board member should do is be an indirect influencer. You ask the question that shines the light on the issue and forces the CEO to revisit an assumption.
Yeah. That's
And
interesting.
that's being an effective board member is not opining, but asking a very well placed question
Yeah.
that sort of stops the discussion.
Yeah. Is there a category where a board member or venture capitalist might actually have uh, generally good advice? And I think of like fundraising, for example, where, why would an entrepreneur know? And you might be able to say to an entrepreneur, hey, I know what you're doing is great, but nobody's going to be interested in this because right now nobody cares about
Yes.
this topic.
You're not
Or,
an it company right now.
yeah, right. Right. Or, hey, 4 months isn't really enough to raise your next round. And, those types of advice.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's an obvious one where operating ideas might have been bad, but their advice on a round will be very good because
Yeah.
they're living in it, right? All their portfolio is going through financing. And there is a lot of value in the currency of what's getting raised and why.
Yeah. So I'm interested in the role of the CEO, founder CEO, as they go through the phases because we come in at the seed stage, and people are doing what they do at the seed stage, which is anything they can to survive and get to the A stage, with 4 or 5 people, which is the whatever the management challenge of 4 or 5 people is. How do you how do you see the role of and by the way, there was a shift. It used to be that the startup guy would kind of get the company to a certain place and you'd fire that guy and bring in the quote real CEO. That Andreessen kind of changed that a little bit. Or a lot of venture firms first round kind of came in and said, hey, we're founder first and the founder should go the whole way. But in a world where you believe, and maybe you don't believe it, that the founder should go the whole way, how is the role changing from a seed stage investment to a series A investment to a series B investment?
Yeah, I would. This is the hardest question because on the one hand, a founder CEO that goes the distance, the returns to the investor are off the charts. So it's not as though investors look and say, "Oh, we're just going to bring in somebody as soon as you get to a stage." There's no reason to do that. And by the way, most boards are very passive, hate making a change,
Right.
often drag their feet. Um, but on the other hand, you know this. I mean, being a CEO is an incredible breadth and depth of skills.
Yep.
And the demands on the role change as the company stage changes. And so
Right.
what made you good as a seed CEO is irrelevant for the product market fit stage. And so that's the challenge is does the person that was, let's call it the technology pioneer, do they really understand how to commercialize and also start to build an organization where they're not the hero anymore? I call it, can you go from uh, if you're piloting a plane, are you flying by sight or are you flying by instrument?
Right.
And often those people have trouble morphing into that. They still want to fly by sight and see everything and touch everything, and you can't if
Yeah.
you're 100 people.
Yeah. Yeah, my understanding is the Google guys had a conversation at some point, I think maybe with John Doerr, where they were going to try to do it themselves, and he was like, "Well, um, I don't
Go
know if I
talk to
want
my
to."
CEOs and see if you think you're that.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
And
Well,
they
that
talked to
seems
McNeely and they talked to a bunch of others and they came back and said,
yeah.
"Holy cow, you're right."
That does seem to be the method, and boy, boards can bring in terrible executives who have the skill set of being good at getting boards to bring them in, but they can also introduce you to people where you think you're doing marketing pretty well, and you meet somebody, and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
oh, that's what a good person's like.
Well, and but the hard person is, and I'm guilty of this too. We've brought in CEOs that were disasters.
Yeah,
That we thought were good, and for whatever reason they were a bad fit, and so in the category of making things worse, we did.
yeah,
So it's never obvious and it's never foolproof.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
but LPs pay us for speed. They want to put the money out and they want it back faster.
right.
And so we do have an obligation. We have an obligation of urgency, not just to sit back and hope.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, the thing that I've experienced was sort of people who are in famous, famous company executive, right? Um, who has seen a lot of growth, and when like it is really good at getting the reason they're in that job is they're good at getting that job, and they're good in a room. They go talk to the board. Oh my gosh, this guy's so impressive. And they show up at your startup and they're like, they can't do anything for less than $600,000 a year, and they can't do anything with less than 20 people and an
Yeah.
executive assistant. And a year later, the entrepreneur's like, did that guy actually grow Google, or was Google just growing and they figured out how to get a job at Google?
Yeah. So that is the other issue is, were you the cause or were you there?
Right.
And I have had, we've both had that experience. You hire, let's call it the celebrity who turns out to be a diva
Right. Yeah.
and and really doesn't want to do the work, wants to be a monarch.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
And,
And by the way, that works. That works in Silicon Valley if you sort of hop from one company to another where you can sort of, you go from Yahoo to Google to Facebook to Uber, and
yes.
you're the kind of assistant general counsel, and like you've got the resume, it just builds on itself, but then you go to a startup and you're like, what the hell is this?
Well, they're absolutely like a fish out of water. They don't know how to find product market fit. They really don't know how to scale the org. They're just and also they know how to spend money. They're really good at that
Oh
and
boy. Yeah.
compensate themselves.
Yeah.
It's that is the hard part about. I mean, I just hiring a CEO is an alchemy in and of itself.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've seen more success with kind of interesting CEO, where you sort of hire somebody who failed at a similar company, but boy, it was just you understand why they failed, and there's a chip on their shoulder, and they're like, I'm not, it's like they've played level 2 of the game once before, and they're like, I'm not opening that door this time, and they take you to level 3.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to success is still a function of you're on the surfboard and the wave came,
Yeah,
and you don't have control over where the wave came, and
right.
so people presume that they were wave generators.
Yeah, right. Well, let me wrap up a little bit as you kind of
Sure.
look across this sort of career of this market crash and banks failing and all the different things that have happened, and, venture changing. I think most notably there being a lot of new entrants into the business. How do you think it's changed better for worse over time?
It's it's better and worse always an eye beholder. I think it's hard to fathom if you've been in the valley for 30 years. It is really hard to fathom what it was like 30 years ago versus today.
Yeah.
It just is. What I would say is that technology now is the base industry of the United States and of the world. And the Valley is the epicenter of it. And it happened in the last 30 years. I mean, look at the top 5 market cap companies, or
Yeah.
40, let's call it. So it is, when you live in it, you can't see how big the trees have become
Yeah.
and where they were. And so I would say the biggest thing, and this is maybe looks to the Gen AI startups, the big mistake that still happens is that technology hysteria generates a flash crowd, which generates investors. And what isn't being done well is figuring out how to make it commercially relevant to a business user or consumer. And so there's a lot of, because it's Gen AI, it's by definition good.
Yeah.
And that's just nobody cares whether it's Gen AI or
Right.
ML or behavioral data science. All they care about is whether it makes their life easier, faster, whether it advances their career or gets them from not being yelled at.
Right.
And so startup entrepreneurs had better understand, how do I translate this into what the customer actually cares about?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Use the example in mobile when, kind of the iPhone came out and you could do payment and geolocation on the phone. And there was an app called Foursquare where you kind of check in, you become
Remember,
mayor of a place. And they were like, what do that idea came from, what do you do with this technology? I can locate something. And then you had Uber where somebody just started with like, I can't get a cab.
yes,
What can I do? Oh, shoot, there's this technology here I can use. And I think with generative AI, my guess with AI in general, my guess is the big companies outside of the platform infrastructure things will be people who say, I'm trying to solve this problem. I couldn't
yes.
solve it oh, now I can solve it in healthcare or in fintech or in, whatever they're focused on.
I ask entrepreneurs, tell me, don't tell me what's under the hood. Tell me what I can do today that I couldn't do yesterday.
Yeah.
And they struggle to answer that question.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And there is the gap you have to figure out.
Yeah. Well, for us, that was all of Web3. What I can put my mortgage on the blockchain.
Yeah,
Never,
yeah.
never knew,
Awesome.
never knew why I wanted that,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
apparently I
It's
know.
a solution in search of a problem, and because of the scale of the venture industry and the scale of the valley, you got a lot more candidates chasing the same sort of mysterious notion of what they should be.
Yeah. And what do you make of the kind of? It's been interesting that when I started, well, as an entrepreneur, they're kind of venture capital stars. There's guys like John Doerr, Mike Moritz, or whatever, and now we kind of have a different kind. It's kind of evolved. It's interesting. You've got like, I guess, on the young side, somebody like Harry Stebbings with a podcast, or David Sachs, who's become famous for having well, podcast, his political views. What what do you kind of make of that?
Yeah,
And maybe Reid Hoffman in the middle, sort of thing.
yeah. So the problem is I will sound like a crotchety old man, get off my lawn when I say this.
Right.
I think it's very dangerous to become a personality or a media thing, because what happens is you start to act like the thing that keeps your attention as a media thing, and that is separate from being an investor. And so you start to perform as a media person instead of being an investor, and those are two different things.
Yeah.
What's on CNBC has not a thing to do with actually astute investing.
Right.
And
Well,
that's the trap, I think.
yeah. I find it wildly entertaining though. Like,
Yeah, it is. It's just you just don't want to be like, you got to jump on a topic and then own it to be in the zeitgeist. But that really has little to do with, like, I believe a big backlash is coming on Gen AI, right? But
yeah.
these people but to talk, you have to talk about it if you're going to be on podcasts.
Yeah. And
And
the backlash being what that AI is not a real thing, or that Gen
no, it's
AI is
just we're going to
overfunded.
go through it. Turns out it's really hard. It has hallucinations.
Yeah.
Debugging the hallucination causes other hallucinations. And so, yes, there's going to be huge impact, and yes, it is coming, but it's not going to, we've over forecasted the short run and we've under forecasted the long run. And we're
Yeah.
about to go into this cognitive dissonance of over forecasting the short run.
Yeah, I think that's right. I've been around for, different technology emergence, like the emergence of the internet. And it was, I mean, not the emergence, the emergence of when you might use the internet, like around Mosaic, and you use it and you're like, this, I don't know what's going to happen, but this is something. This is like, it's
Yes.
incredible. I'm logging into servers in other countries. Incredible. And with Gen AI, I do the Google search and the Gen AI kind of gives me a fine answer. I think when I searched for myself, I founded Airbnb or something like that, which not accurate. So
Yeah.
so there's that. Like it doesn't blow me away that way.
We're gonna go through the trough of disillusionment and then come out of it. It's just that we've got 3,000 companies and $1 trillion chasing it right now.
Yeah,
I
that's
think they're
right.
all expecting a 24-month ROI, and they're
Yeah,
going to be disappointed.
yeah.
right now, the reason it's the picks and shovels. It's NVIDIA.
Yeah.
It's the guys building the infrastructure.
Yeah.
They're and consultants. They're getting the money.
Yeah. Good Lord, we should have all just invested in Nvidia. Like,
Yes, yes,
why go through all
yes.
this? So this is fantastic. What do you, as you kind of look forward, what are you kind of looking forward to in the world of, investing or startups, or what do you kind of see in the future here?
Wow, it's so hard because at my age, I struggle with it's kind of a 0 or 1 thing. You either in the business, you are hustling, you are there, or you're toast. You
Yeah.
can't do a 0.5 effort in startups. You will get crushed. And so the hard part about doing what we do is it's an all-in gig,
Yeah.
and it's hard to sort of does a 23-year-old Gen AI entrepreneur want to listen to a 60-year-old VC who's been around the
Yeah.
block 12 times? Probably not.
Yeah. Well, it seems like there's a lot of VCs who do 0.5 it though, because of the way the economics of the thing work and
Yeah.
the legacy, and they've been around, and you know, I mean, Benchmark's got it set up a certain way. I think at Ignition, you guys have it set up a certain way, but some people have it, set up so you can hang around for a long time.
And I would submit that there are a handful of VCs that do very well in their 50s and 60s, but generally their prime is behind them just
Yeah.
because of the way you operated when you were 30 is so different than when you've made some money and you have a name and you know you think you've got a an efficiency model
Yeah.
when it really is about shoe leather and hustle and being
Yeah.
out in the field.
Yeah. Well, stay tuned. So how do people, like, you've written blogs and you have thoughts and things like that. How would people follow your thinking in this world? LinkedIn or Twitter or you?
Yeah, I mean, I've posted a few things. I'm not a prodigious writer. Because I'm at the end stage of my career. I'm starting to write some stuff down, just because you do get scar tissue
Little
and
wisdom.
pattern recognition after doing it for 25 years.
Yeah.
And often people are very careful about what they say because they're trying to raise a new fund or do a new deal, and I don't have that problem anymore. So I'll start posting some stuff, but most of mine it goes back to what have I learned, and it's about our brain,
Yeah.
and understanding how our brain operates is a really important insight into building a startup.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks, Kent.
All
Yeah.
right. Nick Sturiale has been my guest. This is Something Venture Podcast. Talk to you next time.